When a nation decides to commit economic suicide, it does not announce its intentions. There is no speech, no declaration of war against itself. It simply makes a series of decisions that, one by one, sever the arteries that keep it alive. And by the time the leadership realizes what they have done, the blood is already on the floor. Stand at the Malanville Bridge today. Look north toward Gaia. Listen. There was a time when this border crossing roared with the sound of 1,000 diesel engines idling in unison. Trucks stretched for kilometers, bumper to bumper, carrying rice for the markets of Niamey, machinery for the uranium mines of Arlit, cement for the schools of Maradi. The customs officers worked in rotating shifts because the traffic never stopped. The tea sellers, the mechanics, the money changers, the women carrying trays of bread and boiled eggs, they all fed on the endless river of commerce. Now feed on silence. The bridge is empty. The parking lots are graveyards of immobilized steel. Trucks that arrived in 2023 still sit where they stopped, their tires sinking slowly into the dirt, their cargoes of onions and tomatoes long since turned to dust. The drivers who once navigated the Bamako to Dakar corridor, the Abidjan to Ouagadougou highway, the Cotonou to Niamey lifeline, they now sleep in hammocks strung between their wing mirrors, cook over open fires by the roadside, and ask each other the same question every morning. Did anyone in Cotonou call? Did they say we can move? No one called. What happened between Benin and Niger is not a border dispute. It is not a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is a case study in how quickly a nation can bankrupt itself when it mistakes geography for power and compliance for strategy. Let us be precise about the arithmetic. Before July 2023, the autonomous Port of Cotonou was not primarily serving Benin. It was serving Niger. Between 70 and 80% of the cargo passing through its docks was transit freight, containers that never touched the Beninese market, never paid Beninese consumption taxes, never stayed on Beninese soil for more than the time it took to transfer them from ship to truck. Benin was not selling goods to Niger. Benin was selling access, and Niger was paying. This was the arrangement. Niger, landlocked and dependent, paid transit fees, customs duties, and port handling charges. Benin, coastal and positioned, collected the revenue. It was not partnership. It was rent. And for decades, both countries accepted the transaction because geography had written the terms and neither side knew how to renegotiate. Then the coup came. ECOWAS demanded sanctions. Benin complied. And in that moment of compliance, the government of President Patrice Talon made a catastrophic miscalculation. They believed that Niger had no choice. They believed that a landlocked nation, cut off from the sea, would suffocate within weeks and beg for the old terms. They forgot that a cornered nation does not beg. It improvises. While Benin waited for Niger to collapse, Niger simply turned around. They looked west toward Lomé. They looked east toward the alternative corridors through Nigeria. They looked at the map and asked a question that should have been asked decades ago. Why did we ever make ourselves dependent on a neighbor willing to weaponize our own trade? The weeks became months. The collapse Benin predicted for Niger never arrived, but the collapse Benin inflicted on itself, that arrived on schedule. Customs revenue at the Port of Cotonou dropped by nearly 40% in the first quarter alone. The transport sector, which employed tens of thousands of Beninese citizens, ground to a halt. Banks that had financed trucking fleets began quietly restructuring loans they knew would never be repaid. The northern regions of Benin, which share deeper cultural and economic ties with Niger than with their own capital, entered a recession with no end in sight. Hervé Akinocho, director of the Center for Research and Opinion Polls in Benin, calculated the daily loss, approximately $7 million in oil transit fees alone that Niger would have paid, and now would not. $7 million every day that Benin had counted on. $7 million that evaporated because someone in the presidential palace decided that compliance with Abuja and Paris was more important than the livelihoods of Beninese truck drivers. If you believe that no African nation should be held hostage by another and that no African nation should volunteer to become a hostage taker, tap the like button now. This is the story of how the old model of coastal power died and how the Sahel learned to breathe without permission. The tragedy deepens when you examine the pipeline. The Niger-Benin oil pipeline was not merely an infrastructure project, it was the single largest investment in the region's history. Nearly 2,000 kilometers of steel, $4 billion of Chinese capital, financed by the China National Petroleum Corporation, designed to carry 110,000 barrels of crude per day from the Agadem oil field to the Lomé terminal on Benin's coast. For Niger, it was the key to unlocking the wealth buried under the Ténéré Desert. For Benin, it was passive income, millions of dollars in transit fees that would flow into the treasury without the country having to manufacture a single product or train a single worker. It was, in other words, the perfect colonial arrangement updated for the 21st century. The coast would continue to extract rent from the hinterland. The hinterland would continue to pay. In May 2024, Benin decided to weaponize this pipeline. President Talon announced that if Niger refused to reopen its side of the border to Beninese goods, Benin would block Nigerian oil from leaving the Lomé terminal. The message was clear: open your market to our traders, or we will trap your oil in the desert. It was a classic chokehold strategy, and it failed spectacularly. Niger did not send diplomats to negotiate. They did not dispatch envoys bearing concessions. They simply turned off the pumps. General Tchiani's government announced that the safety of Niger's resources could not be guaranteed on Beninese soil and ordered the flow to stop. The pipeline, built at the cost of billions, went silent. Here is what the coastal strategists failed to understand. Niger had spent the previous year learning how to survive without Benin. They had rerouted their trade through Lomé. They had renegotiated their logistics contracts with Togolese intermediaries. They had accepted higher transportation costs as the price of sovereignty. By the time Benin threatened the pipeline, Niger had already demonstrated that they would endure economic pain rather than submit to political blackmail. The Chinese partners were furious. CNPC had not invested $4 billion to watch their pipeline become a bargaining chip in a border dispute. Beijing does not intervene loudly in African politics, but it applies pressure where it matters. Benin suddenly found itself isolated, not only from its landlocked neighbor, but from its most important bilateral investor. In August 2024, the dam broke. Niger resumed oil exports through the pipeline, and the first cargo, approximately 1 million barrels, was loaded onto the Liberian-flagged tanker Aura M and dispatched to China. Benin had blinked. The pipeline flowed again, but the trust did not return. Now travel to the river itself. The border between Benin and Niger is not entirely land. For long stretches, the two countries are separated by the waters of the Niger River. Before the crisis, travelers crossed the bridge at Malanville to Gaia. When the bridge was closed, they crossed by pirogue. What happened next is a masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. Before the coup, approximately 7,000 to 8,000 people per month entered Niger via the official crossing. The traffic was legal, regulated, and taxed. After the border closure, land crossings ceased, but the migrants kept coming, from Burkina Faso, fleeing jihadist violence in the Sahel and Est regions, from Guinea and Senegal and Gambia, following the ancient migration routes toward Libya and Algeria, and, ultimately, Europe. They could not cross the bridge, so they crossed the river. By December 2023, up to 850 people per day were being smuggled across the Niger River in wooden canoes. The price per passenger increased tenfold, from 500 to 5,000 CFA francs. Bribes payable to security officials multiplied. A smuggling economy emerged that was more organized, more profitable, and more resilient than the formal trade it replaced. When Benin finally cracked down on the river crossings in May 2024, the smugglers simply moved further downstream. They launched from the Alibori River. They launched from the Sota River. They launched from dozens of embarkation points that multiplied as quickly as the authorities could identify them. This is the paradox of prohibition. The harder you try to stop a river, the more channels it carves. Benin thought it was enforcing a blockade against a military junta. In reality, it was financing an underground economy that answered to no state and paid taxes to no treasury. The most devastating consequence, however, is not measurable in customs revenue or pipeline tariffs. It is measurable in trust. Professor Aboubakari Imoro of the University of Abomey-Calavi has spent years studying the social dynamics of the Benin-Niger border. He observes that the populations on both sides share the same languages, the same cultures, often the same families. The border is a colonial artifact, not a civilizational divide. Before the crisis, a trader in Malanville and a trader in Gaia conducted business as cousins, not adversaries. That is over. The Nigerian authorities now openly accuse Benin of permitting foreign forces hostile to Niger to establish bases on its territory. They cite intelligence reports of French military infrastructure in Kandi. They speak of military maneuvers in the W National Park that were, they claim, preparation for destabilization. Whether these accusations are fully substantiated is almost irrelevant. The perception has become reality. Benin is no longer a neighbor. Benin is a security threat. When trust is broken between nations, you cannot simply sign a memorandum of understanding and expect the old habits to return. Trade routes are like rivers. Once they change course, it takes a geological force to push them back into their original beds. The transit traffic that once flowed through Cotonou now flows through Lomé. Togo did not steal this business. Benin handed it over. And now the Sahel is looking beyond the Gulf of Guinea entirely. In late 2023, King Mohammed VI of Morocco announced the Atlantic Initiative, a $1.3 billion port at Dakhla in Western Sahara, designed to give the landlocked Sahel states direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. Niger's foreign minister called the project a godsend. He noted that Morocco was one of the first countries to extend understanding to the new Sahel leadership, at a time when ECOWAS was threatening war. The road network does not yet exist. The security challenges are formidable. The project will take years to materialize, but the political signal is unmistakable. The Sahel states are no longer willing to depend on the goodwill of coastal neighbors who have proven willing to weaponize their geography. They are seeking alternative lifelines, and they are finding them. What then is the final accounting? Benin attempted to enforce a siege. It believed that geography was a weapon and that landlocked nations were hostages. It was wrong. The siege did not break Niger. It broke the Port of Cotonou's business model. It bankrupted Beninese transport companies. It stranded Beninese truck drivers in a parking lot of despair. It accelerated the rise of Togo as the region's premier transit corridor. It damaged Benin's relationship with its most important foreign investor. And it transformed a functional, if unequal, economic partnership into a poisoned well that neither side trusts. Niger, meanwhile, learned that it could survive without Benin. It paid higher costs. It endured inefficiencies. It accepted that its oil would flow intermittently. But it preserved something more valuable than revenue. It preserved the principle that sovereignty cannot be outsourced. The old model, coastal master, hinterland servant, is dying. It is being replaced not by a single new model, but by a proliferation of options. Lomé, Dakar, the Moroccan Atlantic Corridor, the Chad-Cameroon pipeline route. Each alternative carries its own costs and risks, but collectively, they represent something the coastal states never anticipated: competition. Benin is no longer the only door to the sea. It is simply one door among many. And once a customer learns that there are other doors, they do not willingly return to the one that tried to lock them inside. The cranes at Cotonou will move again. The pipeline is flowing. The diplomats have resumed their visits. On the surface, normalcy is returning. But beneath the surface, something fundamental has shifted. The Sahel has learned that geography is not destiny. It is a constraint. Yes, it is a challenge, certainly. But it is not a prison sentence. The landlocked nations of West Africa have discovered that when one door closes, they are capable of building another. And the next time a coastal state threatens to weaponize its coastline, it will find that its former customers have already diversified their supply chains, renegotiated their contracts, and adjusted their expectations. You cannot coerce a nation that has already survived without you. You cannot blackmail a partner who has already mourned your loss and moved on. The trucks are still parked at Malanville. Some of them have been there for nearly 2 years. Their drivers have learned to live without the income they once relied on. Their families have adapted to smaller meals and fewer luxuries. Their children have stopped asking when daddy is coming home because daddy is already home. He sleeps in the cab, eats by the roadside, and waits for a border opening that may never come. This is the human price of geopolitical miscalculation. It is paid not by presidents or ministers, but by men who only wanted to drive their trucks across a bridge and deliver their cargo to a market. It is paid by women who sold tea and bread to those drivers, who now sell nothing. It is paid by customs officers, who once processed 1,000 containers a day, who now process none. And it is paid by the idea of West African integration itself, an idea that was already fragile, already underfunded, already struggling against the weight of colonial borders and post-colonial rivalries. The Benin-Niger crisis did not kill that idea, but it delivered a wound from which the idea may never fully recover. This is Voice of Africa. We do not narrate helplessness. We document consequences. If this story shifted your understanding of what really happened between Benin and Niger, if it helped you see that the crisis was not about coups or sanctions or constitutional order, but about sovereignty and trust and the real cost of compliance, then share this video. Send it to someone who still believes that coastal power is permanent and that landlocked nations must accept whatever terms are offered. Subscribe to Voice of Africa. We trace the new lines being drawn across the African map, not the colonial borders, those remain for now, but the trade corridors, the energy pipelines, the diplomatic alliances that are redrawing the region in real time. And comment below, where are you watching from? City and country. We want to see the full map of this community, the citizens who believe that African nations, coastal or landlocked, should meet each other as equals. The bridge at Malanville is still empty, the trucks are still parked, but the Sahel is breathing. It found another tube. The old door is closed, the new doors are opening, and no one is waiting for permission anymore.